Hey, so you're going to see my conversation with Alan Doyle. I'm always a little bit nervous talking to Alan, even though he's my buddy and we hang out and we're but I think it's hard to overstate just how famous he is to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, and of course to people across the country. So it was a great joy to talk to him about his new book, which is all about a trip he took with his wife and his son all around our home province and what he saw and what he noticed. And we're going to talk a little bit about being a cultural ambassador and what that really means, for him. I mean, go check it out. Alan Doyle is joining me now. Right now from his home in St. John's, which just got over a big snowstorm. How is it back home? How are you?
It was a gross day, so I couldn't make it there in person, but I'm very glad to be on chatting.
How many Irving hot dogs did you eat on this trip around Newfoundland?
Quite a few, which, by the way, there's no shame on an Irving hot dog.
I love an Irving hot dog.
One of the reasons I've always said that I'm sort of tailor-made for a life in a band is that almost all the stuff that people, don't like the Irving hot dog or whatever, I actually still quite like an Irving hot dog. When I was 14 or 15, I wanted to play music for a living and travel. And I'm 56 and I still just want to play music and travel, and so getting to go around Newfoundland and Labrador, in a minivan driving along the Southern Labrador Highway, sounds like probably daunting for most, but I was totally up for it.
What made you want to do it in the first place? What made you want to go on this journey and take Joanne Henry out and hit the road in Newfoundland?
Two things really. Like my favorite kind of book to read are like Bill Bryson type books. Like he's an American writer who writes a lot about traveling but he doesn't do tourist books like to do facts about where he's going. He just walks into a pub with him and you walk in with him and he tells you what he sees and what he hears and what he smells and what it reminds him of from his childhood. And I just always thought I could have what I call writing a book like that. But then also, there's the fact that I was born into what I call the old Newfoundland, right? Like, I was born in Petty Harbour, a little fishing town, and, everybody depended on the fishery and of course, in my early adulthood, the cod moratorium hit the rural Newfoundland, and all of those towns had to change, right? And I was just curious, as to what they changed into. I spent a lifetime, as you say, on the road talking about Newfoundland and cutting out tongues on the wharf and all that stuff. But, if that's the old Newfoundland, what's the new Newfoundland? Which places in our province have paved a new way forward? Have for lack of a better term, for defining the new Newfoundland?
What did you notice? What did you notice when you went out on the road?
Tremendous resilience, some of which I was surprised to see, and then some of it was just like I shouldn't have been at all surprised. Like, to go to Fogo Island and to see the incredible progress they've made in ecotourism kind of part of the province. You realize that the people in Fogo Island, of course, they've had 10 moratoriums in the last. They've reinvented themselves dozens and dozens of times, right? And it's all, it's due to forward thinking and good leadership and all that stuff and hard work, but it's also due to this unwavering desire to stay put and to protect the place that your father protected and your grandfather protected and to stay home with a capital H.
You've been working as, like I said, an ambassador for Newfoundland for a long time. But even before you were in the band, you were doing that work literally as a tour guide at the old Newfoundland Museum on Duckworth Street, right? I can kind of remember it.
Well, there was two. In the summer of 1985, I turned 16 in May, and a teacher at St. Kevin's High School told me that they were looking for museum tour guides in St. John's at two locations, one of which was on Duckworth Street and one of which was in the Murray premises.
Oh, yeah, on Water Street.
I applied for a job and got it. And so a Doyle from Petty Harbour was about to get paid to talk. Now, that was like one of the greatest accomplishments in our lineage altogether. And so I took the job at the Newfoundland Museum in the summer of 1985, and I hitchhiked because we didn't have a car. I hitchhiked back and forth from Petty Harbour to St. John's every morning. And I loved it. I absolutely loved talking about Newfoundland and Labrador, and I loved, I loved being a host to people's, trips and vacations. And this, I spoke about places like Lanza Meadows, and I spoke about places like Battle Harbour, and I spoke about places like Red Bay, Labrador, and this book, some 30, 40 odd years later in some cases, was my first chance to get to some of them. to actually see them in person. So like walking into, for example, like into Red Bay, Labrador was like going into Madison Square Garden or something for me, because I talked about it for so long and I finally got to see it. Port au Choix on the west coast of Newfoundland. I talked about it forever, about the amazing archaeological finds out in the National Historic Park, and I never saw them. And so I got to drive north from Grossmore National Park up to Snatney, and I'd never done that drive in my life. I got to drive down around the south coast, down as far as you can drive, go to Port aux Basques and turn left, if you can imagine. And I went down to Rose Blanche, and it was just an incredible journey to see what's still going on in Newfoundland and Labrador, but also an incredible journey backwards for me to remember that time at the Newfoundland Museum when I talked so highly about these places that were on the panels. But of course, I'd never been to any of them.
I think you're right. I think there's a couple of things there. One is that I have a bit of that myself. Like, I'm so familiar with Ramia and I'm so familiar with Grey River and talking about these places, but I've never, and I even have an idea of what they're like, but I've never been there. And also, I find myself talking to people from outside Newfoundland and Labrador about them a lot, and people tell them about me, and I have to sort of I end up guiding them through their knowledge of Newfoundland and Labrador and what they should know or what they might want to know. Like, what do you remember about people coming into the Newfoundland Museum? What would they ask you? What did you find yourself talking about? What did you learn from watching other people to ask you about where they were visiting?
Well, first of all, they didn't have to come up to me because I ran to them. Yeah. Because Mark Critch always tells the story about meeting me at the Newfoundland Museum, and he was just wandering around downtown one day, and this fella came up to him in the museum and just started talking and wouldn't shut up. And of course, that was me. And I just loved the idea, because I was from Petty Harbour, in this sort of isolated place, and we never got a lot of visitors when I was a kid. They do now. And I was just delighted to meet anybody new, right? And if somebody was coming through the door, and they had a jacket on that said Ontario or British Columbia or, Connecticut or anywhere, I was dying to listen to them as much as I was to talk to them, and learn about where they were from. And so, but one of the things I discovered about Newfoundland and Labrador in my job at the museum was that it has a lot of stuff in it. It's like we have my God, every 10 feet you drive around Newfoundland is a National Historic Site or a national park or something, and or a UNESCO World Heritage Site, there's a lot of history packed onto this island and Labrador, and it's even more vast than I thought. One of the great takeaways for me when myself and our son, finished one of the journeys, I asked Henry, who was 18 at the time, I said, "What do you think of Newfoundland?" He goes, "Dad, it's a very big place, but not many people in it." And I was like, "Yep, that is exactly right." And a lot of us don't even know that. Those of us who are from here don't even quite comprehend how big it is. And it's the whole thing ended up being for me a really cool combo of a journey home, but also to go to a new place, and to be able to do that in your own backyard is a fabulous thing.
You've been talking a lot about the places that you've thought about going for a long time, the places you've imagined going for a really long time. I was also in love with you revisiting places you had gone before, only now you're a bit grown up, and now when you went there is in the past. So one of the things is Grossmore National Park. A lot of people would have been there, the fjords and the waterfalls and all that. Can you tell me a little bit about climbing Grossmore when you were hungover? Was it 24?
Yeah, so in my early 20s, it was myself and Joanne and a few of us, left town, and we drove across the island, and we went camping, of course, in Grossmore Park, when we got there, which would have been, I don't know, 7 or 8 o'clock at night by the time we got there and got tents set up. And then, being young, we started into the evening, and a few guitars came out, and next thing you know, it's way too late to be considering getting up in the morning and hiking Grossmore Mountain. But of course, that's exactly what we did. Over where I grew up on the east coast of Newfoundland, there's hills, but we don't really have mountains like that. I remember going to Banff and Whistler and all that for the first time, going oh, we don't have that. and so we climbed it, and of course, I just remember feeling really poorly physically as we got higher and higher in altitude. And then I remember the humiliation of this 80-year-old guy passing me in flip-flops.
No problem at all. Going up the road, no, nothing to it.
Never broke stride.
I also love that you admit in this book that you hate camping.
I don't love sleeping in tents, and you know what I've done for a living for the last 30 years. I've slept on a bus with 11 other dudes or gals. And it's just like, I don't, when we go home, it's like, I don't want to go in a camper. I just got out of a camper, man. That's what a tour bus is. There's a lot of confessional and family fun in the book too, that I think people have been finding charming, like what it's like to put your, 18-year-old son in a van and drive him to Battle Harbor and back from St. John's, like 4,000 kilometers by the time you get it done. I'm surprised he speaks to us still, like, I love the discovery of it through his eyes, and I love the experience of, as me and Joanne, my wife Joanne, said, look, he's 18. Like, this is probably the last time we're ever going to get him to go in a van with us ever. So off we went, and I'm really glad people are loving the book.
Talk to me about going to Calvert.
To Calvert?
Yeah.
Oh, we're driving up to Calvert and going to Fairyland, to where Jill, of course, has the most amazing hike, the Fairyland picnic. I'm sure you've done it, have you?
Yeah, no, I'm not. I tell you something about me. The way you feel about camping is the way I feel about hiking. I've never really hiked.
There you go. My son doesn't like it either.
And I've never done
hiking.
the Signal Hill hike. I've never done that.
What?
Yeah, in my life.
I don't love camping, but I love hiking.
I'm afraid of heights, man.
It's a wonderful walk you can do. There's a sandwich at the end of the time. You got to do it.
Yeah.
I was going up to Fairyland to do the hike with Jill, but of course I stopped by Calvert on the way because the Squid Jigger is in Calvert.
Tell us about the Squid Jigger.
The Squid Jigger is the first place I ever got paid to play music in my life. And it would have been around that same summer, around the summer I turned 16 in 1985, I bet. And my uncles, of course, my Uncle Ronnie and my Uncle Leonard and a bunch of other people had a couple of bands going on. There was one called the Sandells that they would have had in the, in another band called Medicine Jar. And they would have played all those fishermen's clubs up and down the Southern Shore. Now, I don't want your listeners to think they're like Legion Hall clubs. These are like nightclubs that were all over the place in fishing towns. Every fishing town or every other fishing town had a club where people would go and a band would play on Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, maybe sometimes Sunday afternoon for a matinee. And they would jam.
Yeah, jammed.
They would be packed. And your job was to keep the dance floor full. And of course, when I started playing music when I was 12 or 13, I idolized my uncles because, they had a band, man, with a PA system, and they had a truck to put gear in. And I sort of very quickly started learning how to play all the songs in Uncle Ronnie's band on all the instruments in Uncle Ronnie's band. And then what started happening was that, my uncles would happily play the Friday and Saturday night or whatever, but none of them wanted to go back up and do the Sunday matinee. So I would always step in. And then after a couple of years of subbing in the band, I became a member of the band. And that's, by the time I was in grade 11, I'd probably played 200 professional gigs. And it all started one Sunday afternoon at the Squid Jigger in Calvert, where I got paid $50 to fill in for my Uncle Leonard at the 2-set matinee gig.
So how was the experience in this book, like finding yourself back in places like that?
Oh, it's a lovely full circle moment, and it's also one of the sort of many times in my life, I suppose, where it's kind of a pinch me thing and a grounding mechanism, but also just a very mini sidestep pat on the back a little bit, and to remind myself that we're going to be okay. It's all good. The Squid Jigger's still there, man. You're going to be all right. And, just the other night, I was out doing some press for the book, and, I went back to the hotel in Ottawa, the Chateau Laurier, where I was staying after I did a book event. And in the bar, just sat having a chat, was Mark Critch and David Cochran, CBC pals of ours and Newfoundland pals of ours. And we sat having a discussion, much like you and I are having right now, about look at the three of us. And we're here, we're from about 10 kilometers apart from each other growing up. And here we are at the Chateau Laurier, Holden Court, and it was just, it's a wonderful feeling of, that we've come a long way, yet we still are, man, I still walk back into the Squid Jigger anytime I want. That's very comforting to me.
I was thinking about what you said earlier about the idea that, you're from the old Newfoundland, and I kind of am not. Like I was born in '87, so I mean, by the time I think the cod moratorium, which for people who don't know was the single largest mass layoff in North American history, 30,000 people in one day, happened. I would have been 5 years old, so I don't have any memory of that at all. I got to talk just a couple of days ago to Con O'Brien from the Irish Descendants on this show, and he brought up a point that I had never considered before, and I wanted to ask you about. That he said that when the moratorium happened, and I don't know, would you be old enough to remember the actual the moratorium being announced?
Oh yes, it was in the early 1990s. I was in my early 20s.
Well, because you're right, because Great Big Sea would have released a record the following year.
The next year.
He made the music you have made with Great Big Sea and on your own is so much about the history and the culture of Newfoundland and Labrador. And what Con said to me was that he thinks about how that tragedy, like that mass layoff, actually spurred a lot of the music from Newfoundland and Labrador and spurred a lot of places to play that didn't exist for you to play before. I wonder if you can relate to that at all.
Well, Con is exactly right, and no one knows the effects of the inshore fishery cod moratorium more than Con O'Brien. Because of course his family were fish plant operators and very involved in the fishery, and I think that I think that the cod moratorium made all those small communities have to, in one day, as you say, reinvent themselves. They instantly had to stand up and be proud of what they had, and what we had was songs. And we sang them, and we sang them loud, and we sang them across the country and said, we are still here. Don't you worry one sec that Petty Harbour is not going to be on the map tomorrow because of this cod moratorium, because I'm here to tell you that it is. And I think Con and all the Great Big Sea boys would agree that that was probably not something that we thought of
Yeah, but do you think it was in there somewhere now with a bit of hindsight? Do you think that was in there somewhere?
100%. It was just like I was from a place that was going to be gone, if we didn't think quick. And one of the best pursuits in this book is to find those places that took the results of the cod moratorium and made something really good out of it, and there's lots of them. And it's a joy to find. And, I love, we've been singing about it forever, haven't we? This thing about how important home is to us, disproportionately important to people from Newfoundland and Labrador. And I really enjoyed the fact that we, went on this journey in this book, and I discovered that not only is it there, but it's probably stronger than it's ever been.
How have you found being the sort of, I talked a little bit earlier about, how do I put this now? Like I talked about how a lot of roads that were paved, I think for a lot of us were paved by you guys first, because you were going out in the early 1990s.
Yeah.
And you had to take on a lot of whether you felt it at the time or not, a lot of ambassadorship for Newfoundland and Labrador. And even when you go to Petty Harbour now, you're there on the sign, man, home of Alan Doyle. Can I just ask broadly, I don't think I've ever asked you this, how you found that, how you found the ambassadorship on you and the band when you first went out on the road?
Well, we never took it. We never went looking for it. I can guarantee you that,
Yeah.
And when Great Big Sea started in the early 1990s, and the cod moratorium was going on, and then we got out there and we were singing So Loud and Proud and putting on shows like our lives depended on it, because it did. And people liked it. And then they liked it in the East Coast, and they liked it in Ontario, and then they liked it in the West Coast, and then we were getting signed in the US, and we were getting signed in Germany, and we were getting signed in Denmark and the UK. And by the middle of, in 1996, 1997, we started to really realize that we had a really good chance of being the first thing that people ever heard of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we took that very seriously, and I owe it to Sean and Bob and Daryl and a few other people, but especially those three for making that a very, very, very important title that we assumed. We didn't go looking for it, but once we were told we were ambassadors from Newfoundland and Labrador, we took it seriously, and those guys even led the way more than me.
What does that mean, you took it seriously?
we often found ourselves in, like, there's the famous conflict we had with the organizers of the Canada Day events in Ottawa in the late 90s, where they wanted to tell a bunch of jokes from a Newfie joke book while they were introducing us and stuff, and we just wouldn't have it, So we started, these, 24, 25-year-old kids having a racket with the Canada Day committee, and it ended up being a sort of a sword that we were willing to die on, and for better or for worse, and I'm really glad we did, because I think it, as you said, I think it helped. I think it helped Newfoundland's place in the country.
Yeah, yeah.
I think the fact that right now Newfoundland occupies a completely different place in the Canadian discussion than it did 20, 25 years ago is because, a lot of us stuck to our guns about all that stuff.
I think people would have assumed in those moments that you would have had been the true expert on all things when you're this ambassador of Newfoundland and Labrador. But then you go out on the road to make this book and you see things completely differently than maybe you saw. Do you think doing this trip and writing this book has changed or reframed your relationship with this province that has sort of been a big part of your life, your job, your identity? Yeah. Do you think you see it differently now?
I'm probably more proud of it now than I would have been before, because, as I said, I was from the old Newfoundland and Labrador, and I like that. But I mean, this resilience and this attitude that I thought was there and I hoped was there, I have confirmed is there. And, one of the things I suggest in the book, is that maybe one of our superpowers, here, Newfoundland and Labrador, is that we wake up every morning with no expectation that today is going to be easy. We don't expect it to be, and we're not disappointed if it's not. We just assume it's going to be hard, and we assume, because everything's hard when you live on a frozen rock in the middle of the ocean and you're trying to be a band that has gigs in London, Ontario or San Diego, and you got to drive in a station wagon that you rented in Mount Pearl, or, you end up with this kind of attitude that of course it's going to be hard. And if it's easy, my God, how good is that? But so, you end up with this group of people that over generations really, really smile when the sun shines, because it doesn't always shine, right? And sometimes you gotta make it shine.
It's a beautiful thing to be. I love that answer, man. That I was already. I don't know anyone prouder of this place than you or me and our lucky little crowd. I love that seeing it made you even prouder. Just one last thing. If for someone like me, or if I get people telling me to go to, if people say, hey, I'm going to Newfoundland, where should I go? I either say, hey, go to Grossmorn, or go to town and go to the Ship and go to the Duke. After going on this trip, what am I missing? Well, give me one place people who should visit Newfoundland and Labrador. Maybe it's not in the tourist guide. Maybe it's not what I would tell them to do. Where should they go?
Well, I'd tell you to do the North Trail around Signal Hill, because you got to. It's the greatest city walk you can do on earth.
Will you do it with me? Because I'm afraid of the chain.
It's a bit of it is sketchy, but a drive down the south coast is unbelievable. I don't think many Newfoundlanders know that we can even do a drive down around the south coast, but you can go to Port aux Basques and turn back if you keep going. And that little drive down in Rose Blanche and in that zone is really otherworldly beautiful and spectacular. And the south coast of Newfoundland is almost inaccessible by car, but there is a little bit that is, and it's worth it. That was a surprise to me, and I'd never been there before, and it was pretty amazing.
Alan, thanks for coming on. Congratulations on the book.
Thanks so much.